This is The Power of Solar with Mr. Tim Appenzeller and Daniel Nocera.
You'll have a lot more, buddy. Let them trickle in for a moment more. Why everyone sits in the back. Well, I think we're going to start. And maybe the sound of our voices will lure people in. Welcome to the afternoon session on the power of solar. We've heard an awful lot about energy at this forum, probably more about food, but a lot about energy. And I would say that most of it has been has been incremental, sort of visions of how what we already have today could be deployed faster in different ways. More biofuels, more natural gas, large-scale solar. Well, in this session, you're going to hear about something quite a bit more radical. So we're very lucky to have Dan Nocera with us today. And I'm going to tell you two important things about Dan Nocera. First of all, he's a very distinguished chemist. He's the Henry Dreyfuss Professor of Chemistry at MIT, Professor of Energy, and he's also a Professor of Chemistry there. And he and his group study how plants and sort of chemical systems made in the lab can capture and transform energy. The other important thing is that he is a committed deadhead. He left home quite young to follow the Grateful Dead. And apparently still has a great collection of bootleg recordings, if anyone is interested. And this is more relevant than you might think, as Dan explained to me at breakfast. The Grateful Dead drew people who were nonconformists in many ways, and those are the kinds of people who can think out of the box often. And out-of-the-box thinking is what you're going to hear about here. So what do you get when you put together that kind of thinking with sort of very sophisticated chemistry of the kind that his group does? Well, you just might get an answer to the energy puzzle, which is one of the biggest challenges the world faces now. How do we power the planet and provide at least some fraction of the very nice lifestyle we enjoy in the developed world to the billions of people who don't have it and the billions yet to come? So please welcome Dan Nocera, who is going to tell us about his vision for how that might be done. Okay.
And Tim, you can prompt me in the middle of discussing things. I think you wanted me to start off with sort of a global energy picture, right?
Well, actually, I think what I was going to ask you is how you got from chemistry to that global energy picture.
Right.
I mean, you're working on a very fine scale in your lab. How did you end up thinking about this big picture of energy, and what is the big picture of energy, and what we'll need in the future?
Yeah. So today, there's different ways to talk about energy, and I'm going to mention it in the terms of power, which is energy per unit time, because then you don't need to worry about of whether it's a day or a year I'm talking about, because it's a burn rate. It's like burning a light bulb. And so you're burning in this world right now a 15 trillion watt light bulb. That's how big your light bulb is 15 trillion watts. And you have to give energy to that light bulb. And when you start looking at the whole picture of the energy game, you can then say, all right, if I'm at 15 trillion watts now, how much will I be in the future? And that's the way I started thinking about this in terms of getting into the energy game. And what you need to do is you only need to know 3 numbers to predict energy. And you can calculate what your energy use will be. You need to know the population, how many people, because you all use energy. You have to know GDP per person, so the gross GDP in a country per capita. And then you have to know a thing called energy intensity, which is energy use per GDP, and that's a mathematical term for conservation. So if you can grow your GDP and use less energy, you're conserving. And so if you know those three numbers, you can predict future energy, and the number you get in 2050, using very conservative estimates of GDP growth. And what I mean by that is we, in the United States, if you've been using a lot of resources and you have a big GDP, other countries haven't been. One thing that this country is having a lot of trouble getting their heads around is they're going to have to give stuff up now because it's a sustainable world. And so if you have China and other countries growing at a lot of GDP, then the ones that have been growing at high GDP are going to go down. And there's just no avoiding it. In America, I'm always amused that we want democracy everywhere until it starts infringing on our lifestyle. Then all of a sudden, we're not so sure about it anymore. And so when you do that calculation, you're going to find out you're going to need 30 terawatts energy to power 30 terawatts in 40 years.
So this is assuming that the poorer parts of the world are going to raise their standard of living, raise their GDP.
Right. I did a global calculation of 2.3% GDP globally, which is kind of the historic number for the world. And then what is the real driver? If you start thinking about energy, then it's the number of people.
Right.
So it's us getting to 9 to 10 billion people. That's why you're going to need 15 terawatts, not you out there. And that's what I call the legacy world. You're the legacy. You've inherited energy. It's these extra people coming, and there's 3 billion new people to come, and 3 billion low energy users. So it's those 6 billion people that get you to this big number of 30 terawatts.
So you're basically doubling the size of this global light bulb.
That's right.
And so what are the possible sources for that?
So if you start thinking about all the types of energy you can use, so we've heard a lot about, well, first you're going to have coal, oil, and gas, all right? So you're going to do that, much to my chagrin, but it just, I just was with Steve Chu and Kuhn the other day, and they almost, they say this is a big energy machine. It's going to take 30 to 35 years to even nudge. That's how, this is the Secretary of Energy saying this. And so you're going to use a lot of coal, oil, and gas, and that's why you've been listening to lots of people worry about that. But I'd rather do a different thought experiment, and so here's a thought experiment you can do. Let's be totally green. So it's always good to be a professor because you can just do whatever you feel like. So I'm going to be totally green, and I'm not going to add any more coal, oil, and gas to the 15 terawatt mix. We'll just keep it constant. And now I'm going to need another 15 terawatts. And so then the question becomes, where could I get it from? So you hear about biomass, and that's a good source of energy potentially, but you have to realize plants weren't told to be oil wells for us in the year 2050. Nobody clued a plant in that they're supposed to be an energy source. And so and if you look at photosynthetic efficiencies, you hear always the efficiency of a solar system. So here's the ceiling. You can't ever go above this for any photosynthetic organism, 10%, right? That's the theoretical limit for biomass or for photosynthesis. And a paper just came out in Science last week where I helped assemble 35 of the best scientists in the world, both in photovoltaics and in plants and crop management. And we locked ourselves in a room in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 3 days until we all had consensus with these numbers. And so there's a definitive paper now out that will just tell you you're never going to be over 10%. The best crops grow at 1%.
So that means basically that the energy you can get out of them when you cut them down and burn them or turn them into ethanol or whatever
is
just
1%
of the sunlight.
Of the sunlight. So it's a 1%. So you can think of a VC company and you run into them and say, I have the best new technology for solar. It's a 1% solar technology. Now, why does it have feet or legs? it has legs because we know how to throw seeds in the ground and grow stuff. But at the end, it doesn't have enough capacity for this energy need. And so I can do this calculation, which we can't do scientifically, is if I take sugar plus oxygen and burn it all the way to CO2 and water, I can calculate how much energy I would get out. And that means cellulose and lignin and hemicellulose. We don't even know how to do that stuff. But I'll just take CH2O, that's the code word for carbohydrate, plus oxygen. I'll say I'm going to cover the entire face of the planet with the fastest growing crops, and then I'm going to burn them. The number you get is only 6 terawatts of energy, okay? And I need 15. And that's because of this 1% number. Now, you hear about algae. Algae gets legs because that algae can get up to like 5%. So that's why algae is so interesting to people, and you hear that a lot. But in general, biomass just doesn't have the firepower to get 15 terawatts of energy. You should use it if you have it, and you can use it responsibly, but that's the deal. If you want nuclear, that's I need 8 terawatts. I'm going to try to get to 15 now. So if I just got 6 from the plants, I'll take 8 terawatts from nuclear. A nuclear power plant puts out a gig. So 8 terawatts divided by a gigawatt's 8,000. And I need it in 40 years. So 8,000 divided by 40 is 200, which means you got to build me a new nuclear power plant, 200 a year, one every 1.5 days, okay, to get 8 terawatts. So now you're starting to get a feeling of the scope of this problem and how hard it's going to be to get 15 terawatts.
So where do the 15 terawatts come from ultimately? Where are you going to get them?
So I think I know where you're going to get them. You're going to keep using coal, oil, and gas, but that's not my concern. So let's go back. I'm going to tell you about how, so we got to 50, I need 15 terawatts. I forgot to tell you one thing, which is very disconcerting. In my calculation, I assumed that you were going to save 15 terawatts of energy by the year 2050. All right? So if you don't do that, you're going to need 44 terawatts of energy, not 30. So first, everything you hear about conservation, it has to happen. But it's still, that means you're the most responsible citizens in the world. You're in the legacy world. You've done everything properly. And I still need 15 terawatts because the driver's coming from these 6 billion people who don't use energy. And actually, so, and basically they each get an energy assignment. And from that, that's where you get the 15 terawatts. So the first thing is you have to think, and this gets back to your original question, how from the chemistry bench do you get to these bigger problems? If you're going to head off the greenhouse gas problem, then the place you really have to do it is for these 6 billion people. And they're called non-legacy because they haven't inherited a lot of garbage. Remember, you have really dumb things you live with because you admit it now, because you all want a smart grid, right? That means you've had something really dumb, or you wouldn't be calling it a smart grid. By inference, it's stupid. So it's a dumb thing you're living with, and so why do you want to go and take something that's dumb and 100 years old and give it to those 6 billion people? And so the way to, at least for me as an individual scientist, to head off the greenhouse gas problem is to get the 6 billion people carbon neutral energy as quickly as possible.
So what form of energy is this?
And I would like, maybe it's the power of the sun. Solar, maybe solar. So, you know, there's a lot. So solar hits the face of the planet. There's a lot of it. There's plenty of solar. We'll get in a few minutes, maybe I'll tell you how easy this problem really is to solve. So this is a totally doable problem, 15 terawatts. I'll just tell quickly how that might happen. And that is you have sunlight that hits plants. And so I told you plants are only 1% efficient in terms of solar energy storage. They're incredibly efficient energy machines, right? Just like you did today, you ate a little bit of food, and now you're going to burn it all the way off. And that's what the plants do. They aren't using the energy and storing it. So that's what plants, but they're very good energy machines. So how do they work? They take sunlight, and then the first thing a plant does is it splits water to oxygen. You know that from maybe grade school. And then hydrogen. That you probably don't know. Because you always think about the sugar part, right? So it's sunlight plus water plus carbon dioxide gives you sugar and O2. But the first part up front is water splitting. You take sunlight and you break the bonds of water into hydrogen and oxygen, and those are fuels. Now, plants don't have hydrogen bubbling out. It stores it as a solid form of hydrogen. It then takes the hydrogen and combines it with CO2 to make sugar, but in that process, the plant stored no energy. Every bit of energy storage comes from taking water to hydrogen and oxygen. And so what's happened then is sunlight has come into the water, and then you've used the energy or power of the sun to rearrange the bonds of water to make hydrogen and oxygen, and then you've stored the sunlight in those bonds of hydrogen and oxygen. That hydrogen then gets translated with CO2 to sugar. So there's a few things I want you to think about today, by the end of today. One is, when you then eat the sugar, what happens? You break it back down to CO2, and then you get the hydrogen. And then in your body, you have a thing called cytochrome C oxidase. It's in your mitochondria. It takes the hydrogen and oxygen that, remember, was split by the sun to make water, to hydrogen and oxygen from water. It then takes that hydrogen and oxygen and combines it in your mitochondria, and that's a fuel cell. That's what's powering you right now. That's why you're working. You have this fuel cell taking the hydrogen and oxygen that came from the sunlight, rearranging water, and that's what's powering you.
So what you're trying to mimic technologically is the first part of what the plant
That
does,
first
right?
part.
The sunlight to split water into hydrogen and oxygen.
That's right. But let me just tell you about what the plant thing, because this is really neat. If you just think about what I said, I took water plus CO2, and we make sugar plus oxygen. Then you eat oxygen and sugar, you get CO2 and water back through that step of hydrogen. The only thing that came in was sunlight, if you think about it, right? I didn't add anything to this. I'm just recycling atoms of carbon dioxide and water and just rearranging them. So when you're eating a green leafy vegetable, what's the only new input that's gone in there? It's the sun. Do you realize when you chew green leafy vegetables, you're chewing photons from the sun? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. You really are. You eat the sun. And the sun just gets captured in a usable form of the food. And then what you're doing is you're then breaking that back down to the hydrogen and oxygen. So what are you doing inside? You're releasing sunlight inside you. So you're all bright and shiny people. You don't know that. But that's the world energy balance that's worked for 2.5 billion years. And then you guys decided to do an experiment last 150, and it's not working out so well. Mm-hmm. So I would like to go back to the old way of doing things and just using sunlight plus water to make hydrogen and oxygen. If you don't like hydrogen, then combine it with CO2 and make a liquid fuel. That technology still needs to be done on small scale. And now what happens? If I take the hydrogen and oxygen and recombine it, then I get my energy back from the sun plus water. So the overall cycle was sunlight in. If I had an energy system that could harness that sunlight, split the water to hydrogen and oxygen, then when I reburn the hydrogen and oxygen, I get water back, closed cycle. I'm not using any water up, okay? And I release energy.
So why haven't we been able to do that a long time? And we got solar cells, which harvest the sunlight, make electricity.
Right.
You can do electrolysis of water,
Yep.
split it to hydrogen and oxygen.
Yep.
So what's the problem?
So what's the problem? It's always cost. So here's the good news. There's going to be all good news for you guys, by the way, all right? So first, here's the first piece of good news, is I can take, I'm going to take one step back. Remember I told you I need 15 terawatts of energy? So here's our thought experiment. How much water do I have to split per second using sunlight to get 15 terawatts? How much water do you think I need? Remember those big numbers? Like an ocean? 1/3 an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Okay? So what I'm saying, but now this is per second, but I have to have an energy system operating per second that's taking the equivalent of 1/3 a swimming pool of water to hydrogen and oxygen. You're not using that water up because somewhere else around the world, somebody's recombining the hydrogen and oxygen. You get the water back and the sunlight's released. Okay? So that's the first good news is I'm only dealing with a pool of water and sunlight, and therefore I need an energy system. And what Tim just said is exactly right. I could go, here's the second piece of good news. In the last 30 years, a lot of scientists get mad at me for speaking at things like this because they think I'm going to give you hope. And then when it doesn't happen, you're going to get really angry at us and totally stop funding us, all right? So they always write me nasty emails that I'm getting too much out in the public and I'm giving people hope, all right? So let me tell you why I feel so confident that we can do this. Because I can go on Google and build it for you right now, right? So in the last 30 years, science has done this, whether you realize it or not. You can go and buy a photovoltaic on Google. I could wire it to an electrolyzer. Electrolyzers take electricity and split water to hydrogen and oxygen. I can put those in tanks, and then I can take the hydrogen and oxygen and burn them to in a fuel cell, and I could power your house at home. And you would never need any more. You could be self-sufficient power station. So
why don't we do that?
Wait, don't clap yet, because you don't want to do it. So you can do it, but guess what? It's too costly. What are you going to do? And it's not too costly, right? The mantra should not be it's too costly. It's coal's too cheap, right? So that's the real problem. And so you're going to then say, oh, it's 4 cents per watt hour. I'm going to look at my electricity bill, and my payback time is going to be this, and therefore we won't do it. And that's why we aren't doing it, right? But you can do it right now if you wanted to as a society. But it's going to cost money. And so the real challenge then, and this is why I have great faith in science and engineering, is there's no showstopper here. What we just need to do is invent stuff to do what we already know how to do, but make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's a lot of creativity. That's a lot of scientists working day and night. But that's exactly what science is good at. Sometimes they're not so good at identifying big problems. That gets too much for them. But you give them this is just more generally. You give them a door opening, they'll open that door and drive the cost down. Yep. So if people are really committed, I guarantee that they can drive the cost down into this thing.
Well, let me give away the plan, if I may. Was that you've invented something that ought to be the opening to drive the cost down, to make this cheap enough that it could keep these these billions who will be needing more energy from going down the road we've gone.
Yeah.
Big centralized energy systems, and it's essentially an artificial leaf.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So what we did, and this is what generally happens in science, there are things called paradigm shifts. So let me tell you the best way I can describe a paradigm shift. And that is that you have something, you do all your calculations, just like I just did for you. I said 15 terawatts more because I assigned all these people energy. I should mention, the first time that was done in a way for society was in 1898. It was in New York City. There was a civil engineering conference, and they were there driven to desperation by, guess what? Horse manure. Because what they did is they said, horses, only rich people own horses, and we know how much stuff comes out of a horse. There are all these poor people over here. They don't own horses, but they will someday because GDP's growing. So we can weigh how much horse manure is going to come out of them. And when they did the calculation, it's just like I'm doing. Instead of a horse with manure, it's a person with energy. They came out that the streets of London would be 9 feet deep in horse manure, and that the streets in New York City, horse manure would go to the 3rd story of every building. And they didn't see the paradigm shift, which is the automobile. And that's given us new problems, but that took that whole problem away. So the first thing is to note in that story is that shift happens, okay? Thanks. I worked pretty hard for that one. So we have a little shift happening in our group right now. And what we did is we made a catalyst. It turns out what you can, as a scientist now, you just backtrack. And so I said, wow, electrolyzers are expensive. And they're expensive because they have to work in harsh conditions. They work in concentrated base, not important. And they have to because the materials that do the water splitting break down. They corrode. And so you have to run them in very concentrated base. That means heavy engineering, and you get to prices of $4,000 to $12,000 per kilowatt. And what we decided to do a few years ago is we said, what happens if I were to use simple materials to break the water down, albean water, so simple conditions, because that's going to drive costs down. But what's the science problem? I'm going to have things breaking down or corroding. So what we did is we made, and this was in 2008, we made the first self-healing catalyst. And this catalyst could heal itself. And so you could take it, put it in a glass of water, hook it up to a photovoltaic, and then it would start splitting the water to hydrogen and oxygen. And so we did that 3 years ago. That's worked out really well.
And you could use it in ordinary water, any kind of water?
Use any type of water. So what's really new about this too is we've been running out of the Charles River in front of MIT, which is pretty dirty. You can get a puddle on the ground. I could take the water right here and use it. In these electrolyzers, you need really pure water. And so going to the pour with really pure water is not an option because you got to get the water there. And people want to drink it anyway. So it's a lot better if you can just go outside and take some water from the ground, and you're good to go. And it's because of this self-healing nature of the catalyst. We were then able to make another catalyst to get rid of the platinum. So now we have really cheap electrolyzers that work in very simple conditions. And the hope is with a piece of PV, a solar photovoltaic, you can hook up the catalyst and then split the water to hydrogen and oxygen. It turns out we can have a discussion about the differences of what the non-legacy world is versus legacy, but you're not using much water. So let me just tell you, you guys use around a kilowatt, 1.5 kilowatts per hour in the United States. And remember, GDP scales with that. So if I could get somebody 100 watts an hour, there'll be 2.4 kilowatt hours in a day. They would have 1/10 the energy use of an average American. And remember, GDP scales with energy use, so I can bring them out of poverty really quickly. To do 100 watts an hour, guess how much water I need to split? 1 drinking bottle of water and a half. You know, you're drinking
per day?
Per day, and that's it. That will give them 100 watts an hour. And so you're not storing a lot of hydrogen in tanks. You're not using a lot of water to do this, and you can totally change lifestyle. It's also highly distributed, right? Because each one of us are going to have our own little bottle and a half of water, and we'll all have it. And that's why I'm saying before, you'll be doing a pool worth of water per second, but you're not using it up because
that's the whole world.
Yeah, this is the whole world. Because then your little bottle and a half that went to hydrogen and oxygen, when the sun goes down at night, you burn the hydrogen and oxygen and you get the energy back again.
So tell us a little bit about how you get to that vision from here. I mean, how cheap is this, or how cheap could it be?
This is version 1.0, solar panel hooked to electrolyzer. There's still a cost element here. You'll always say solar photovoltaic panels are too expensive. And they are. They're expensive, but you want to know the silicon in the solar photovoltaic that's giving you all the energy, that's only 5% of the total installed cost of the PV. The rest of it is all the wiring. It's everything else, right? And so if we've gone one step further, which is the artificial leaf, is we've been able to instead of taking the wires off of the PV, what happens is when sunlight hits the silicon, it sets up a wireless current inside the silicon. Then you put wires on there and you get the electricity out. So what we did is we just took the single crystal silicon, put our catalyst on both sides of it, and then when the sunlight makes the wireless current, our catalysts get that, and they're the self-healing catalyst, and then they split water. So we just had another big breakthrough in terms of cost, because now I don't need to buy a PV panel and hook it up.
So you've got this little sandwich, basically,
Yeah.
that you put in water and you hold the water up to the sun.
You just hold it
and
up
out
to the
comes
sun and
gas.
you can watch the gas bubble out. Yeah. So it's that simple. There's a lot of chemistry going on in there, but it's that simple. Our first version, 1.0, though, is we're going to go with a solar photovoltaic panel with a cheap electrolyzer. We're not even going to use fuel cells because they're too expensive. I've hooked up with a team of people who have micro turbines, and we're just going to burn the hydrogen in a small micro turbine.
Dan, can you explain just briefly, one vision of this is that you'd use the hydrogen and oxygen, run it through a fuel cell and get electricity, right?
Right.
But in your first version, you're going to
You
actually
could get
burn it.
electricity out of the turbine, but you could burn the hydrogen directly as a fuel. That's right.
Yeah. So how cheap is this setup?
And so right now, our electrolyzers are for 100 watts. They're down at under $100. We're going down to we'll hopefully be in the tens of dollars pretty soon, because we're not doing anything sophisticated. Now, I had to give something up. I don't want to make nothing comes for free. That $12,000 electrolyzer just pumps out the hydrogen per unit time. It is super fast. The thing I did is I didn't want to be efficient, all right? I wanted to be low cost, so I gave up efficiency. So I operate a factor of 10 slower than an electrolyzer. But sunlight isn't coming down that quickly, so I'm matched to what's called the solar flux, so I don't need all that extra performance. And so that's why we're so much cheaper right now than a commercial electrolyzer. We still have the cost of the photovoltaic panel, for an average home, for 100 watts an hour, I probably need a PV that's not much bigger than a door, a little bit bigger, and then a bottle and a half of water.
So
We should be able to do it.
you've described this as kind of fast food energy.
Right.
It's cheap. You can manufacture huge numbers of them pretty quickly. Where are you first rolling it out? Where's your first
Yeah, and
franchise?
we'll be in India. So what I decided is I just couldn't discuss anymore, this legacy world. And that's what you've been hearing all week, by the way. That's why it's always a little depressing. And people say, boy, I'm really depressed. Because you keep hearing about this huge locomotive on the train. It's so hard to nudge off the track. And so the easiest place to do is to go where they aren't imprinted. And that is the non-legacy world, because they haven't inherited anything. And so we're working in India pretty hard right now. I have a partner. I'm very lucky. I have Mr. Ratan Tata. And so Mr. Tata and I are working really hard right now. And by the end of this year, we hope to have some prototypes on the ground. I won't really know the cost until we really make the prototypes, assemble the system, and then we'll go from there.
You were telling me this morning that you have an advantage in that Tata just bought BP's solarness.
He bought half of BP Solar, so there's silicon. So this is what's important. What happened for me, this is kind of a different discussion but related, is the VC model just doesn't work in energy. Sorry, it's a dead system. It's because you need return on investment. And so the only return on investment you're going to get that's fast enough in the VC world is to make something incrementally different. Because you're not, look at what I'm talking about right now. I have to change the housing industry. I have to change how, there's codes. You have to build systems. And so you're just going to you talk to a VC, you know what they want you to do? Grid storage. That's what they want you to do, because they can see you can make some money there. You need to have real patience, and the VC model doesn't have patience, right? Everybody needs to make money. And so that's where you go to these large multinational conglomerates in that part of the world. They have a better understanding of their world, and they understand that patience model a little bit better than we do.
So I want to ask you a little bit about this, legacy, non-legacy distinction. I mean, India is quickly becoming part of that, the legacy world in the sense they're building a lot of coal-fired power plants. And
Right.
Are you worried that that the train may be leaving the station in a way that more and more people are getting on the grid and won't be open to this model?
Yep. So what you have to do is go down fighting. So this is what I'm doing. By the way, I think you're all going to be dead in 50 years, so don't worry about it. But at any rate, I wrote an article called "Living Healthy on the Planet," and I always just say, I had to save the world, save the world, save the world. And Kurt Vonnegut contacted me and said, don't worry about saving the planet. She's just going to be just perfectly fine. But it's you guys that are really screwed, right? I mean, the planet's going to be wonderful, by the way. It really will be. Even under heavy CO2, it will become absolutely awesome. It just won't be able to support 9 billion of you. So you're in trouble, not the planet. So that should also make you feel comforted. I don't know why. It makes me feel good. I don't know why. But at any rate, they are moving quickly, and so this is a race against time. I mean, you don't have time to goof around here. And that's why, I used to say 10 years. I was on CNN, the first column said, why do scientists always say 10 years? Which was an incredibly brilliant question, because now I listen to scientists all the time. They say 10 years. I went to 8.1254 years as a joke, and then in the press it said, he's really doing it because he's really calculated the rollout time. But now, if I don't do this under 4 years, I'm working hard with Mr. Tata. It's definitely like we're thinking a paradigm shift. But time is of the essence because of what you're saying. Luckily, in India, I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's called semi-urban. There's urban, like Mumbai, and then semi-urban, by the way, is only 6 miles outside of Mumbai. Like if you're giving a talk there, every hour, you'll have the lights just go completely out for around a minute, minute and a half. Nobody even does anything. They just wait until the lights come back on. And so in India, the grid is still very unstable and can be imprinted. But in 20 years from now, it won't be. Mm-hmm. So, this has got to happen immediately and as fast as possible. This is sands running through the hourglass right now. And
people in the developing world presumably want more than 100 watts of electricity, which is what you're aiming at first. I mean, they want fuel for a car.
Right.
Can you get that out of your system?
Yeah. So fuel for a car is a really tough one using the sun for one reason. That's why. So I'm a big battery fan. By the way, you could say, why don't you just use batteries? Because batteries don't have enough energy density. You already did the experiment. You could have chose batteries 100 years ago. You went with fuels because they're 100 to 1,000 times more energy dense than a battery. And batteries can't get much more energy density. Don't let anybody fool you. I mean, you can improve it somewhat, but you're not going to get to fuel standards. And the reason is you put an electron in a battery, you put an electron in a battery. Unless you can condense matter or not have it weigh more, you can't increase energy density.
Because the electrons push apart.
Because, it's just the physical state of matter. I got to put electrons on all these centers, and it's just the density of matter. And so, but does that mean, so batteries aren't going to do the job for 15 terawatts of storage of energy? It's incomprehensible to know how many batteries that would be. But why are the batteries important? It's because they are good for transportation needs. And that's why in this part of the world, you look at a whole bunch of energy options to charge those batteries because the solar flux isn't coming down fast enough to keep up with the amount of energy you use to drive. So you have to generate using renewables off vehicle to some, you can probably make 9% over the course of a day on a vehicle for fuel mileage, 11% for light cars, but you have to generate off grid.
So give
or
us
rather off vehicle to
give
do
us a
fuel.
picture of the whole system. You've got the photovoltaics, and you've got the water splitting. Then you need something to store the hydrogen, right? Is that hard? I mean, there's a lot of hydrogen even out of 1.5 liters of water.
Right. We're going to just use an aluminum tank because I don't need to get to If you're going to go 400 kilometers in a car, you need these big reinforced carbon tanks. They're really expensive. If you're splitting a bottle and a half of water, I can just use an aluminum tank, and then we'll just take that hydrogen through a turbine. And so that will be our first rollout. Then the next step is this artificial leaf where I don't even have a photovoltaic. Nobody's ever really done this in a meaningful way. I should, again, just let me take one step back. The artificial leaf is not new. In 1998, just not far from here, in NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, my friend John Turner built exactly what I'm sort of talking about, but he used space-age materials. So it came out to like $40,000 per square meter, okay? But, so again, all my invention has been to do what we already kind of knew how to do, but to drive the cost way down. And so there's another example of what, there's lots of examples of this. But because nobody's been able to do it cheaply, nobody's even thought about what a device will look like. So one of the nice things about the discovery is I can now take version 1, PV plus electrolyzer, versus the artificial leaf and do a cost-by-cost, side-by-side comparison and see if there's big advantages in cost.
Yeah. So if you can get it out there in time, I mean, what could go wrong? What are your worries? What are your fears about this?
Yeah, so my biggest fear, and this is always the case when you're especially going to be in a part of the world that's emerging, it has to be low maintenance and it has to be reliable. I mean, you can't have a bunch of people running around the world fixing stuff.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about irrigation pumps that break down.
Yeah, so you just can't. So this thing, it's my research, but one thing I like about it is the simplicity in terms of the design of how the chemistry works. It probably gives me a little bit better shot than most to make very simple engineered systems. But it all comes down to simplicity, which isn't how science usually works. What we work is high efficiency. You always hear that word, efficiency, what science is. If you're going to be efficient, it's going to be really complicated usually, okay? And it's going to be expensive. And so if I had to have one gripe, I don't have too many gripes against my colleagues. They all work hard. And when I say my colleagues globally, scientists, I wish America could get a little insight to see how people work like 18, 19 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? I mean, this is what scientists do because they love what they do. And, but my one gripe is they don't get up in the morning and think about the poor or simplicity. More times than not, we think about complexity. We love that word. And I think for the energy challenge, especially to the poor, you got to really reorient your thinking and do science in a simple way. The fact that we're simple, I have more hope than usual that I'll have a low maintenance system. But to build it, you kick the tires, you're not going to know. So that's why these prototypes are really important to me to roll out by the end of the year.
So if you get these out in large numbers, I mean, what other kinds of problems could they solve? I mean, this produces water for one thing.
Yeah, we haven't worked a lot on this, but remember I told you we can use any water source. You can even use human wastewater. So think about this. If my catalyst works in human wastewater, then I make hydrogen and oxygen. When they recombine, you get clean drinking water. Now, that's an open system, though. See, now that's an open system. That's not a closed system. There's a lot more engineering challenges, actually, with that. But there's the potential to do distributed water generation, too. And, there's a whole bunch of spin-offs. This is a really important lesson. If you just remember anything, in photosynthesis, all the solar energy is stored in water splitting, hydrogen and oxygen. If there are some other bright scientists that come along and figure out a way to take hydrogen and nitrogen in a very distributed way, we do this on large scales, to ammonia, then you could do distributed farming and fertilizing. And so hydrogen is the key. You can start, again, this takes lots of discovery. I'm not saying this is around the corner. We know how to do everything on super large centralized scales. That's the Haber-Bosch product. We know how to make fertilizers, but we don't know how to do it in a distributed way cheaply for the poor. But once you're at that hydrogen stage, there's a whole bunch of things that you can start imagining.
So this is the hydrogen economy reimagined.
It's not. Yeah,
what they were
yeah.
talking
I'm not
about
a
in the
fan of the
90s.
hydrogen economy, by the way, even though I'm using hydrogen, because the last thing I would want to do with hydrogen is put it in big containers and have it in pipelines and move it around the world. It's a dumb thing to do. It's not dumb, though. You can't escape hydrogen because of what I told you. Because if you want to use, all I'm saying is sunlight plus water, you're good to go. You have to deal with hydrogen, but you do it in a very distributed way. And you know, my vision someday is your house will be its own power station and gas station. And for the poor, it would be cool if scientists come up with a cheap way to take hydrogen and nitrogen and they can do their own farming too.
So you've talked about this as a model for the, for the developing world, for the 6 billion or so that are not already attached to the grid.
Right.
6 billion in 2050, that is. What about us in the legacy world? Are we just going to stick with our centralized power systems and just kind of keep?
You will.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're just doomed. So the one thing I always like to say to I say to Mr. Tada, and I say it to everybody. Sometimes we'll write and say, "Oh, Nocera's helping the poor." At least I do science for the poor. I actually am not helping the poor at all. That's the most ridiculous thing in the world. You will be very happy to know who's going to help. It's the poor is helping you, right? Because they're going to teach you how to live for the future. And so the one thing is you're not helping the poor at all. You're just getting in their way. They're ready to move, by the way. They really are. And they're going to end up being your teachers. And so that's my hope, is once you start seeing this in parts of the world where they live in a much better way than we do, there's one thing I always bank on in the legacy world, and it's you'll stick with it as long as you can, but there's one thing that always gets us is jealousy. So I'm just hoping you're going to become so damn jealous, you're going to say, screw it, I'm going to start living like these people. There's one other thing too, and that is, and this is a value-added piece, and we talked a little bit about this morning, is in my inbox and email today, I'll have over 100 messages from people in the United States saying, can I have one of your systems? I'm on the grid, but I want to get off. So one thing, we always talk about carbon pricing, and it's not happening, and then we all get dejected. And what we haven't done is take the opportunity. I see it on my screen every day. There's real value that people will pay for, which isn't a tax, to be off the grid and have energy independence, especially in this country. And I haven't, maybe somebody out there has done done some calculations, but that hasn't really been quantified yet. And I can just see it. It's like one of these tipping points. I get so many emails. I just know it's going to break at some point, and I think it's going to break on this idea of energy independence. That's my hope. And jealousy.
Living off the grid.
Yeah, getting off the
wants to
grid.
do that.
Not being beholden to somebody for your energy. You will be in control of your own energy.
So that seems a good moment to stop and take some questions from the audience. We have microphones. Man in the green vest there.
My question is on solar flux.
Yeah.
Okay, everything you described is known in the biological world as photosystem 2. There's a reaction center within the chloroplast complex. Now, has the engineering world stopped to think about capitalizing on the nanometer of light, white light? The solar flux you're talking about is 100% white, right?
More or less, it's the light hitting the face of the planet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Within that is I think it's somewhere around 660 nanometers of light is the light that is needed to activate the photosystem 2 reaction center. Have you or anybody else ever thought about doing something about doing the efficiency of cutting down the light to that a very narrow wavelength.
Yeah. So what usually happens is you go the other way, because what you want to do is collect as much light as possible. And that's where the plants fail, because they have two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, and they both absorb light almost at the same wavelength. If you could make a plant absorb, photosystem 2 absorb one color of the spectrum, and then the other part absorb the other color, then they would collect more of the sunlight. And so in the field, the jargon is what's called tandem photovoltaics. And what a tandem photovoltaic is, it's putting different materials together into a photovoltaic material to get away from single wavelengths and get as broad a spectrum as possible. And so that's one of the forefront areas of photovoltaic research, is to sort of fuzzy a plant and not be so specific in light absorption and get more light absorption. On the flip side, what you brought up is a really good point. In this article that just came out in Science, people have started talking about where's one way you could really make a big advance in biomass. And that is to develop plants that are tandem photovoltaics, where they absorb different light. So that hasn't really been tackled hard yet, but it's something that I think is on the horizon in biology, molecular biology.
That's not going to push biomass back into a contender. I mean, even if we could genetically modify plants.
If you could, then you could get plants up to, if you could get plants up to 8 to 10%, that might be pretty neat, and that would be a good energy system. Yeah. But they have to be engineered, and they wouldn't look anything like a plant as you now know it.
So, question, man in the green shirt there. Please identify yourself too.
Yeah, I'm James Arnott from the Aspen Global Change Institute. So as you were talking, I was thinking about the movie Who Killed the Electric Car? And
yep.
I was thinking about, in the future, how do we prevent a movie being made, Who Killed the Artificial Leaf? And if you're talking about us becoming our own power stations, we're obliterating the need for an energy service economy.
Right.
And that part of the economy currently has a lot of money right now, right, and doesn't want to lose that. So, but right, we need this right now, and there's inertia in the system. So how do we handle that?
Okay. So what I did is, the company that's commercializing this, the person ahead of my scientific advisory board is John Deutsch, who used to run the CIA. So that's how I'm going to keep from getting killed. I'm going to go and kill everybody else. So that's how we're going to do that part. Then secondly, in terms of the oil company, oil companies or big electric power utility companies, see, this model's, they've been actually, I have to tell you, they've been great supporters, because they don't give energy to this part of the world already. They know they can't go build big power plants easily, because the poor don't have money for a large centralized system. And so I would just say it's been mild apathy. I have felt no antagonism. If anything, encourage. If I want to be very crass about it, they're hoping I do a really good job, because they'll end up owning it, and I just opened up a huge new market for them, if I want to be crass about it. So, but your point is really well taken. That's why I gave up on the legacy world. I'm doing a redistribution of wealth, and that isn't something that happens easily in any sector. So that's why I think the non-legacy world is the key here, because I don't have that momentum to fight against. The challenge there is cost. They don't have a lot of money, so I have to be a damn good scientist, right? But I just took out that huge problem you're worried about. Now, you're stuck with it here. I feel sorry for you. I can't help you.
In the back, please.
My name is Andrew Birmingham with Montreux Energy. I spent a lot of time about 8 or 10 years ago working on hydrogen, launch of a hydrogen.com website. And I think one of the things we came up against was an awful lot of inertia and an awful lot of people just saying, well, we've got better options, and also a lot of resistance just to the concept of hydrogen. How do you market a clear, odorless, colorless, tasteless gas?
Right.
But we had a really good marketing person, and she said, well, if Nike can brand air, we can brand hydrogen. So off we went, but have decided to do other things until the market catches up. But I actually don't, what I'm about to say, I have to say I don't think I disagree with you on the non-legacy, but I think there's some great things we can and should be doing right under our noses, or rather I should say right above our heads. And Amory Lovins has this great comment: if the underside of automobiles, if the underside of airplanes were as ugly as the underside of automobiles, the planes would never take off. Well, on the roofs of buildings, why can't we rethink the roofs of buildings so that we can have, instead of hydrogen gen sets and other UPS systems that may or may not work, why don't we put all of your vision on the tops of new buildings, schools, so that the hydrogen is generated up there, it's stored up there, and it's converted back to electricity up there. And that's highly visible, and hopefully very much a part of a teaching opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, look, the hydrogen issue, I just want to, again, there's another piece. If hydrogen could be combined with carbon dioxide, like the plants do, cheaply, then you have a liquid fuel, this problem's gone. I mean, we're ready to go, because we can just move this very quickly into an established society. We already use these fuels. It's just always hard to get adoption in new things. I mean, I'm sure if you were in this hydrogen game, you spent a lot of time thinking about it. I'm hoping, I mean, but I really think it's the legacy, non-legacy people that will be the catalyst. And then what you're saying, I think maybe I'm being too pessimistic on how quick as early adopters we might be. But I still think the key is the non-legacy.
Question from Carl Pope.
Carl Pope, Sierra Club. Okay, you're going to give me cheap hydrogen in my village, off-grid in Madhya Pradesh. Who's working on making sure that the process for turning that cheap hydrogen into cheap electrons is kept cheap and simple? Because you've got quite a few steps you got to go through there, and that engineering hasn't been done yet.
So that's why, Carl, when I said a third of a pool and then I went to a full pool, it's because no energy system's 100% efficient. So my overall efficiency would run at around 30%, okay, just now as it stands. And the cheap electrons that come back, right now, I'm just going to burn in or use as a fuel directly with these turbines, turbines. They're relatively cheap. I can't say totally. That's stuff that's held within the Tata group, but they have some pretty nice technologies. Okay, and if you remember, Mr. Tata also bought Jaguar, and they're good. There's a lot of hydrogen technologies out there to burn it directly. Okay, but there's a more important point that you're bringing up. So fuel cells are expensive, but they don't have to be. Okay. The reason why fuel cells are expensive is because they've been designed with the automobile in mind, and that you have to get from 0 to 60 really quickly. You need a high power density. And so if you look at a fuel cell, it is a heavily engineered system. You're using really expensive catalysts because you need to get a lot of energy per unit time. If I now need to get energy out slowly over the course of the day, I'll argue that those fuel cells are way over-designed, just like I'm telling you for electrolyzers, they were way over-designed. And so my hope is once people get their head around what I'm saying in terms of energy use per unit time, people saw a market that the fuel cell costs are going to come way down quickly because they aren't going to need to get that really high power density. And if you can then, there's even other things. You talk about what I'm talking about, but then put a little wind in, you can actually start reducing even the amount of storage that you need because, you know, the wind can blow when the sun isn't shining too. So there's a whole bunch of things I think once people say, I want to make an energy system for poor that's just really low cost, a lot of invention and creation can make that happen. That's why I feel a lot of optimism. It's just that's the question that people haven't been asking. They haven't been focused on that part of the world yet.
More questions? Yes.
My name's Gates Gooding. I'm just trying to understand this technically a little bit better. Is there a benefit besides storage that you get by adding, if you're going to use the hydrogen and the oxygen to make electricity again, is there a benefit that you get by adding this intermediate step instead of just doing
No.
electric directly?
No, that's what Carl's saying. Whenever you do extra steps, you're going to lose efficiency, right? And so during the day, you would not want to be doing what I'm doing. If you have the sun hitting your PV, run your house or run what you're using. But on the side, I'm going to be making it so when the sun goes down, all that sort. Then I have a storage mechanism. But it's just exactly what Carl was just mentioning. Every time you add steps, it's not good because you're going to lose something in efficiencies, right?
Yes, in the front, please.
Gang He. I have two questions. One question is on the catalyst. Can you explain more on the catalyst? Is it that expensive and is that easy to get? And the second question is, you work for the season where close to the poor. So what kind of government policy you need to scale up that or speed up that, or international policy you need?
Yeah. So first, the catalysts are very inexpensive and they self-assemble. We use nickel and borate, and we use cobalt and phosphate, and we use some simple metal alloys. So they're all earth abundant and they're self-healing. So they're very cheap. Those types of catalysts are the ones that always have to operate in concentrated base, and then you get the expensive systems cost. But because of our healing mechanism, we got rid of that problem. So we have really cheap materials costs and cheap engineering costs. In terms of the government, this is what a lot of this week has been about. There's a complexity and tapestry in every country with every government. In the case like India, I can't even begin to think about how to handle India. But my partners live there, and that's what they do for a living. They even get frustrated, right? And with government, you can read about it. But you have to do that. In other words, the only way this is going to work is to partner with the people who live there, not for me to come in, right? So maybe GE can do it. Maybe they can go into a country and try to, get technology in there. It's just a lot easier when you become the partner with the country and provide them that. So that's what I have to hope for. I'm not going to do it.
Yes.
Chad Lipton from National Geographic. Do you see fertilizer playing a role or a big role in energy storage or transportation?
That's a great question. If you can have the hydrogen's a gas. So one thing I said is hydrogen plus CO2 goes to liquid fuel. The other thing is if I could take hydrogen to nitrogen, which we do on large scale, and make ammonia, and then I had a catalyst to get the hydrogen back off again, and then I would release nitrogen, I've stored hydrogen. And ammonia you can make as a liquid under pressure. And so you've heard about hydrogen storage before, maybe different types of materials. There'll be a block that hydrogen absorbs. I think one that really should be looked at heavily is N2 plus hydrogen to ammonia back to hydrogen, and N2 again as a hydrogen storage mechanism. Hasn't been researched heavily, but it's one of the highest energy densities I could get in terms of storing hydrogen.
Dennis has a question.
These are all, by the way, everything you're mentioning are all what is driving. I mean, part of me being here today is just to give you a little insight about what are scientists doing. So that's something they're looking at. The CO2 problem they're looking at. How to do fuel. I mean, all of it is just like an all-out frontal attack right now.
Hi, Dimick from National Geographic. Dan, two questions. One, does the system able to use salt water? And two, what's the time frame you're thinking about for being able to see a prototype of the first plant out of Tata?
Yeah. So work out of salt water. So the catalysts do work out of brine, and we've worked out of Boston Harbor. And then the prototype I want to have on the ground in December of this year. So we want a prototype there so we can really start testing it. Things like Carl brought up, is there something better we can bring in instantaneously to burn the hydrogen or use the hydrogen? So our goal is December 2011, prototypes on the ground, where we start engineering full systems.
Dan, just to follow up, so the prototypes will actually be in people's houses? They'll be supplying energy to
Yeah,
individual
we've chosen
houses?
some sites that we will use those. Yeah, so it will as near as we can to hopefully having a system that's running. The other thing I should say is in Japan is one of the leaders in greenhouse design. So we are looking and working a lot with Japanese companies who do home green design from the ground up, materials all the way to building. Again, the Japanese are way further ahead of us in that sort of area than we are in the United States. And so what's kind of nice now is a lot of people are coming to us and opening up lots of opportunities for that. But we are trying to get to full system integration as quickly as we can.
Yeah. I have a question there.
Stephen Johnson, finishing a book I call Integrity at Scale. Big question, small question. Big question, you say 30 terawatts of energy globally on an ongoing basis. The sun gives us, what, 1.1 million terawatts per second?
Yeah.
Roughly?
Yeah, you get a lot. Just you have plenty of sun, 800, just usable. Like they say, this is the number you hear all the time. More sun hits the Earth's surface in 1 hour, or as much sun in 1 hour, as you use globally in the entire year. So there's a lot of it. So that's why it's good to then adapt an energy system that's distributed. It matches well.
Yeah. So smaller question. As I understand, Joseph Romm, who has written about hydrogen, he says for 100 photons of sunshine, if you have a photovoltaic cell, you get maybe 10 photons of electricity, or possibly a little better. And if you want to convert that to hydrogen, you get maybe 2 photons worth of hydrogen net. Are you more efficient than that, or just a lot cheaper, or both?
Yeah, efficiency, right, I can give you a precise number on it. It's 6 photons to water, to hydrogen and oxygen. So that's the system as it's running full. I should be careful. This is, you take a PV, a photovoltaic, on the artificial leaf. We're just publishing this now. So if you have a 10% solar cell, that was the 10 photons, then you'll get 6% hydrogen production. If you give me a 20% solar cell, 12%. And we haven't even engineered it yet. That's an engineering limitation about how to move the water around the leaf. So it's only going to go up. But the efficiency for water splitting in general is a 70% to 80% thing.
Question here? I'm not sure.
Hello, Eric Seif at About Institute. You mentioned making ammonia. They've been burning ammonia in vehicles, engines since the 20s, 30s. Why not go straight to ammonia and use that in the microturbine? Why even go to hydrogen?
Oh, the reason is when you split the water, you get hydrogen. That's the first thing you get. To get to the ammonia, nitrogen plus hydrogen to ammonia, that's really not a very efficient thing to do when you get to small scale. The way we do that at massive chemistry plants, and we get the economy of scale of doing it. But a whole bunch of research will have to be done to try to do nitrogen and hydrogen to ammonia at a very distributed scale, because it's too costly again. We know how to do it, it's too costly. So it's a step that I have to put in there that I don't even know how to do yet. So that's why I'm just going with the hydrogen. I would love to have hydrogen plus CO2 to liquid fuel. That would take and again, we know how to do that. That's called Fischer-Tropsch chemistry. But we do it at massive scales. We don't do it at little scales in a distributed way. Then it gets costly. So all these things are just hydrogen storage mechanisms, just like the plant stores hydrogen with CO2 as sugar. It doesn't store it. It's not getting any extra energy. It's just a hydrogen storage mechanism.
Question over there.
Hi, Heather Russo, Aspen Daily News. I'm curious how you think the system will impact our natural water resources. Is there any negative impacts?
I hope not, because like I was saying, we're not dealing with a lot of water for this, and you're not using it up. Because once you charge the system, it's a closed cycle, hydrogen and oxygen from water, and then when you reburn it, whatever way, through a fuel cell, through a turbine, you get that water back, so it's a closed cycle. And like I was saying, it's only a pool, you're dealing with a pool equivalent for 15 terawatts. Now, of course, it's a lot more water because it's got to be spread out all over, and then but you're not dealing with a lot of water. That's why photosynthesis decided to do it that way. It was smart in 2.5 billion years. And we're really dumb because we stopped listening to nature. So I'm just listening to nature again. So we use up a lot of water in this.
Question over there.
Tom Bernard, Breckenridge, Colorado. Hydrogen is, of course, very explosive, and it's also difficult to build tanks that contain it because hydrogen corrodes the tank. Can you tell me how you've looked at the safety considerations of this?
So DOE's done, there'll be a report coming out from the National Petroleum Council. I'm on it, on the study session. It's going to be the future of fuels. Amory's on it. I don't know if he's here still, but the hydrogen issue has been, in terms of safety, has been pretty vetted by DOE. Hydrogen tends to go up really quickly, versus gasoline, which stays on the ground. I know everybody thinks of Hindenburg, but remember, that wasn't hydrogen burning. That was the shellac on the shell that was burning. The hydrogen was gone instantaneously. But you're bringing up an important point. Hydrogen, so here's a big stumbling block. The way you deal with gases like this, it's all local fire codes. We don't even have like federal standards for this stuff. So at the end of the day, my druthers would be not to use hydrogen. I just can't wait. It was what Tim was saying. This is like a tick time bomb, hydrogen, the energy problem. And I just can't wait right now. But as soon as I can offload hydrogen gas to something else, I'm going to. The key step is using sunlight to split the water to get the hydrogen and oxygen. Then I can interface to whatever technology that shows up to get rid of the hydrogen. But right now, I'm just going to have to live with it. In terms of the tank, you're right. When you go to high pressure, it embrittles the tank, and the tanks become unstable. If you stay below what's called 250 atmospheres, hydrogen doesn't embrittle the metal. But so why don't they do that on cars? Why are the tanks? Because then the tanks would have to be too big to go 400 kilometers. But to bury them outside on the ground, be that big, and we won't pressurize them that high. So we'll be able to use simple materials.
Dan, I'm going to, as a take the privilege of asking a question. I mean, you said that your colleagues say people so much hope. What other kinds of what's the toughest skepticism you've faced from other scientists?
It's usually, I think the science community's been really supportive. There's a lot, I'll tell you, this is uncomfortable stuff. A lot of people get federal funding. If you do something that's really different, you take people out of their comfort zone. And they like attacking. So, but that's just that's how we work. And at the end, it's got to be really these what scientists will always worry about is efficiency issues. And I am not highly efficient. I'm just being really low cost. And so most of the skepticism, or what they find troubling, is that I'm not running at super high efficiencies, or I won't be at high efficiencies, where everything for me has been cost, use cheap materials with simple engineering design. So I think they're slowly getting their heads around that. Again, you have to show them, and then once they understand that, they get what you're saying, and then they all start taking that track. But I will say, this catalyst I've developed has become very popular around the world. Lots of scientists are now using it. But I want to just give you a feeling that this is one breakthrough. There are lots of breakthroughs happening right now that you don't know about yet. All right? It's all happening. It's like this, The community is supercharged about this whole energy problem. They're probably not as empowered as much as they should be, right? There's always these financial restrictions, but it's the will of the science and engineering community will deliver on this because there's no showstopper. If you ask me about fusion, then I always get a little skeptical because there's some showstoppers, like real science problems that might not be developed. But in terms of everything I'm saying, there are no showstoppers here. We know how to do it. It's just invention and creation to drive costs down. And it will happen more quickly if the imperative is from you because, you know, that's fund federal research dollars.
Well, I think that's a good point to leave it. And Dan, thanks so much for giving us this very hopeful picture. Thank you.